Have you ever stopped to think that sometimes the greatest danger isn't what we can see, but what remains invisible? Well, it is. This is the kind of reflection that bothers us, but it can't be ignored. Before we begin, I want to ask you, are you already subscribed to the channel? If not, please subscribe, like, and comment, because that's what keeps this investigation alive and makes this content reach more people. The disappearance of a child is in itself one of any family's worst nightmares. But what happens when the evidence suggests they vanished after following an imaginary friend? Here begins the paradox. Something that seems innocent can actually be a gateway to the unknown. It's at this point that reality and legend merge, and fear turns to suspicion. Many believe that imaginary friends are merely a product of childhood fantasy. Others swear that, in some cases, they can be manifestations of something much larger and more disturbing. What do you believe? Because today I'm going to tell you a story that defies both psychology and common sense. A narrative that, with every detail, uproots certainties and sows even more doubts. And get ready, this isn't one of those obvious stories you'll find out there. We'll explore a disappearance shrouded in mystery, with thrilling twists and turns, and clues that point to something far beyond our explanation. The case of the child and the invisible man isn't just an investigation, it's a delve into the shadows of what we call reality. I clearly remember the first time I heard about the case. A child, just 7 years old, had disappeared without a trace. So far, nothing new to me. After all, disappearances are unfortunately part of my work routine. But the detail that caught my attention was the reason she'd disappeared. The girl claimed to talk frequently to an imaginary friend. And on that fateful night, she went out to find him and never returned. When I arrived in the small town where it all happened, I immediately noticed a heavy mood in the air. It wasn't just sadness. There was also fear. Parents held their children by the hands, as if they might escape at any moment, and neighbors whispered on street corners, eyeing each other suspiciously. It's curious how, faced with a mystery, everyone creates their own version of the story. And believe me, each rumor seemed more absurd and more intriguing than the last. What disturbed me wasn't just the disappearance itself, but the nature of the child's account, an imaginary friend, that sounded familiar. I'd investigated other cases where children described invisible figures, and there was almost always something more behind it. Either it was a deep trauma, or something science couldn't easily explain. And honestly, both scenarios gave me chills. In the midst of the first searches, I realized we wouldn't find answers just on the surface. The case required a deeper dive, beyond the obvious clues. Because when a child disappears without a trace, and all the evidence points to an invisible presence, it's not just a common crime. It's as if we were facing a puzzle with all the right pieces missing. And that, my friend, was just the beginning. The last time anyone saw the child was on a seemingly ordinary afternoon. She was in the backyard, swinging alone and laughing, as if sharing secrets with someone invisible. Witnesses reported hearing her cheerful voice, answering questions that, obviously, no one there had asked. This detail caught my attention because it wasn't just childish play, but rather a structured conversation, almost too real to be just a figment of imagination. I spoke with an elderly neighbor who swore she saw the girl gesturing, pointing into empty air, as if someone were actually standing in front of her. She even described the moment the child seemed to hold a hand that wasn't there. I listened to this story in silence. But inside, a part of me trembled. Because I'd heard very similar accounts in other cases I'd investigated, and none of them had ended well. Interestingly, that same afternoon, a younger neighbor said he'd noticed something different. He couldn't explain it, but he reported an uneasy sensation in the air, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped, despite the blazing sun. These details, often overlooked, are like small, hidden clues. The rational mind dismisses them, but an investigator's instinct won't let them be forgotten. And my instinct screamed something invisible was there. It's at this point in the investigation that we realize how tenuous the line between reality and imagination can be. A child talking to herself may seem innocent, but when several people describe the same scene, doubt begins to gnaw. That girl's last contact wasn't just a silent farewell, it was a sign that someone or something was with her, ready to take her beyond what our eyes can see. Every serious investigation begins with the family, because it's in their most intimate circle that secrets can change the entire course of a case. However, Upon entering that girl's home, I immediately realized the atmosphere wasn't the most peaceful. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. There were emotional scars that didn't appear in police reports, but screamed between the lines. The mother, visibly exhausted, carried the shadow of depression in her eyes. The father, a man with a hard voice and a lost look, carried the burden of alcoholism. Their arguments were constant, and all the neighbors knew about it. The child, it seemed, sought refuge in this so-called invisible friend, as if he were an escape from the pain he witnessed at home. And honestly, it wouldn't be the first time I'd seen something like this. When questioned, the mother said her daughter had an overactive imagination, but she didn't hide her discomfort. The father, on the other hand, disdained the idea of an imaginary friend, and between sentences let out a certain aggressiveness that didn't go unnoticed. Years of experience have taught me that, often, the enemy lives within the home, and this made me pay even closer attention to every detail. But there was something curious. Despite all the family problems, the child seemed to have found some kind of solace in this invisible presence, as if this friend were more trustworthy than any adult around. This mixture of emotional fragility and a mysterious entity was dangerous. I could already sense that we were facing a case where the psychological and the supernatural intertwined in a frighteningly precise way. As a researcher, I've learned that before delving into the inexplicable, it's important to understand the obvious. Children often create imaginary friends, and this is generally healthy. It's a psychological resource for coping with loneliness, exercising creativity, and often expressing feelings they can't put into words. But in this case, what caught my attention was the richness of detail. The girl described the invisible man's voice, height, clothing, and even smell. I spoke with a child psychologist who had accompanied the child in several sessions. She told me that, when talking about the invisible friend, the girl didn't display the playful sparkle typically seen in games. On the contrary, she spoke seriously, almost as if she were describing a real adult. This alerted me, because when imagination gives way to concrete stories, there's always something beyond the ordinary. This type of behavior can indicate projected trauma, such as when a child transforms fears and pain into characters to try to bear the weight of reality. However, in some cases I've investigated, the psychological explanation didn't quite cover it all. I remember another child who described an imaginary friend with details of a deceased relative she'd never met. Coincidence? Maybe, but I didn't believe in coincidences as much anymore. The girl didn't seem to be playing with the invisible, but obeying it. There was something in the way she referred to the man that sounded more like submission than amusement. And that difference is stark, because when a child begins to follow orders from something no one else sees, we're no longer dealing with a fantasy. We're dealing with a possible link between the psychological and the supernatural, a link that, believe me, is far more dangerous than one might imagine. It was in the girl's room that I found the first truly disturbing clue. The door had been locked since her disappearance, as if her parents were afraid to face that empty space. When I finally entered, the air felt heavy, dense, almost as if the atmosphere held secrets. On the table were dozens of papers with pencil drawings, faceless human figures, always holding hands with a child who clearly represented the missing girl. These drawings caught my attention, not only for their content, but also for their pattern. They were repetitive, almost obsessive, as if the child were trying to capture a constant presence. In some, the invisible man was merely a slender shadow. In others, he was a tall figure, but always without defined features. Anyone who has investigated cases of childhood trauma knows that art is a powerful reflection of the mind. But this went beyond the psychological. I spent hours examining every detail until I noticed that some of the drawings had strange symbols scrawled in the background, as if they were codes or markings. Neither parent could explain it, and this only heightened the feeling that something was eluding them. These weren't typical childish symbols. There was an intention there, almost as if someone or something had influenced the girl to draw them. What intrigued me most was a final drawing, hidden under the bed. Unlike the others, this one showed the child walking away from home, hand in hand with the faceless figure. The shaky caption read, "He will take me to a better place." It was then that I realized this wasn't just a joke or a childish delusion. It was an announcement, an omen, and in a way, a warning that we were only scratching the surface. As soon as I started listening to my neighbors, I realized that this street held more secrets than it seemed. A woman who lived across the street said that, on several early mornings, she would hear children's laughter coming from her little girl's backyard, even when she should have been asleep. She swore the child was talking to someone, and on some nights she even heard a second voice, deep, low, impossible to identify. A couple living next door reported something even more disturbing, figures walking around the yard at odd hours. They said that whenever they tried to approach the window to check, the living room light would flicker or simply go out. Electrical coincidence? Perhaps. But as an investigator, I've learned never to dismiss the unexplainable just because logic demands it. Often, logic is the first to fail. There was also a young woman who used to pass by the house on her way home from work. She said she felt inexplicable chills when crossing the sidewalk, as if she were being watched by invisible eyes. Curiously, she reported that this only happened on days when the girl was in the yard. For her, it was as if this friend wasn't limited to the child's imagination, but actually had a tangible presence. These accounts, however fragmented and confusing, formed a mosaic of invisible clues. Each witness brought a detail that, when placed side by side, began to paint a frighteningly coherent picture. It was as if they had all seen pieces of the same entity, but no one could see it completely. And it was at this point that I realized the case wasn't confined to a single child. The invisible was already stalking the entire neighborhood. As I compiled the neighbors' accounts and compared them with the girl's drawings, I couldn't ignore the pattern that was beginning to emerge. The descriptions of faceless shadows, the deep voices, the figures appearing in the early morning hours, all of this recalled old archives I had studied in other investigations. These were stories that science classified as folklore, but which, curiously, always appeared in similar contexts: vulnerable children, unstable homes, and invisible entities presenting themselves as friends. In paranormal literature, there's a recurring figure known as the Dark Companion, a being who approaches lonely children, offering comfort, but gradually alienates them from the real world. Hearing the mother and older sister's descriptions, I immediately remembered these stories. It wasn't just an overactive imagination. There was an invisible script playing out, almost as if it were a universal haunting pattern. For years, I collected similar stories from small communities, and they all had something in common. The entity never appeared to adults. It always manifested itself only to children, as if seeking a special vulnerability in them. This made me reflect on how emotional fragility often opens doors we don't know about. Doors that, perhaps, lead access to something we'd rather never have seen. At that moment, the investigation was no longer just criminal, but rather delved into much more nebulous territory. We were dealing with a possible link between psychological disorders and paranormal manifestation, and the line between the two is so thin that by the time we realize it, it's already too late. The case of the missing girl seemed to be living proof that the invisible, when it insists on approaching, never comes without a price. Every investigation needs a starting point, and in this case, the first focus fell on the girl's father. It wasn't just because of his harsh demeanor or alcoholism, but because in almost all disappearances, the police start with those closest to him. His history of angry outbursts and constant arguments with his wife raised red flags, and frankly, part of me was suspicious too. In the first interviews, the father displayed a coldness that bothered me. He answered curtly, as if he were more concerned with clearing his own name than finding his daughter. He denied any involvement, but his lost gaze and nervous hands betrayed the weight he carried. As an investigator, I learned that words can lie, but actions almost never do. However, there was something strange about his defense. He said he had no need to fear because he knew his daughter wasn't dead. According to him, she had been taken by the so-called invisible friend. When I heard this, I confess I was torn. Was it a cynical excuse to escape guilt, or a genuine conviction that something inexplicable was at play? The fact is, the more he talked, the more doubt grew. The investigation against him progressed, but with each clue collected, nothing concretely incriminated him. It was like trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. He had motives, he had the profile, but there was no proof. And in this vacuum of evidence, the case began to take on even more disturbing dimensions. Because if it wasn't him, then who or what was behind the disappearance? It was when I spoke to the older sister that the course of the investigation completely changed. The 13-year-old seemed to carry in her eyes a mixture of fear and relief at finally being able to speak. She confessed that she also occasionally saw the invisible man. The detail that gave me chills was that her description matched the drawings of her missing sister, exactly, tall, faceless, always standing in the shadows of the backyard. The young woman said that some nights she would wake up feeling someone sitting on the edge of her bed. She never saw it clearly, but she sensed their presence and heard slow, heavy breathing, as if she weren't alone. She tried to scream, but her voice simply wouldn't come out. This type of report is common in cases of sleep paralysis, but her conviction left no room for doubt. It wasn't a dream. It was too real to dismiss. There was a moment when she tearfully admitted to being envious of her younger sister. She said the invisible man always seemed more interested in the youngest, as if he had chosen his favorite. This revelation was painful because it revealed not only the terror of the experience, but also the emotional complexity involved. Imagine growing up in a troubled home, watching your sister gain the attention of a presence that, while frightening, offered a strange sense of companionship. For me, the older sister's testimony was the missing piece that confirmed this. We weren't dealing with an isolated delusion. There was consistency between the two children's accounts, which removed the case from the realm of coincidence. And, as any good investigator knows, when two witnesses describe the same invisible thing, it's because, somehow, it's really there. As the search for the child intensified, something began to catch the team's attention. The police radios, used for communication, began to fail whenever we approached the house. Hissing, interference, and, at times, incomprehensible voices emerged amidst the noise. It was as if someone or something was trying to communicate, but on a frequency that didn't belong to this world. The surveillance cameras weren't cooperating either. Whenever they were pointed at the backyard, they would freeze at exactly 3 in the morning. This repetition couldn't be a coincidence. Reviewing the footage, we noticed that, in the seconds before the freeze, an elongated shadow appeared on the screen, but never in focus. I'd seen similar phenomena in other cases, but each time I witnessed it, the chills were inevitable. One night, during a sweep, I felt my temperature drop sharply. I looked at my colleagues and noticed they were all shivering, as if the air had grown heavier. One of the officers, a natural skeptic, said nervously, "This is something out of a movie." I smiled, but deep down I knew, when physics fails to explain it, it's because we're dealing with something that transcends natural laws. These small phenomena weren't concrete evidence for the police, but for me, they were clear signs that an interfering presence was at work. The girl's disappearance wasn't an isolated case of runaway or kidnapping. It was as if invisible forces were deliberately hindering the investigation. And when the invisible decides to play with reality, it's a sign that the game is just beginning. The further I went, the more I realized that this disappearance was not an isolated event. Scouring old municipal records, I found archived cases of missing children from the 1970s. In all of them, the pattern was eerily similar. Tales of imaginary friends, invisible voices, and families destroyed by unexplained absences. The city held a past that insisted on being forgotten. In newspapers at the time, there were short, discreet, almost hushed articles, no sensational headlines, just small notes mentioning unexplained disappearances. The silence was so glaring that it made me suspicious. Why didn't anyone want to talk about this? I spoke to older residents and noticed that, when I brought up the subject, their expressions would change, their gaze would shift, and they would quickly end the conversation. It was like poking at an old wound. A curious detail emerged when I cross-referenced the dates of these disappearances with meteorological records. In all cases, there were reports of sudden temperature changes and power outages in the region. Coincidence? Perhaps, but as I often say, the devil is in the details, and these details repeated themselves with eerie precision. It wasn't just a sporadic event, it was almost a cycle. The most intriguing thing is that these disappearances were never officially solved. They were filed away as no trace or insufficient evidence. And when a pattern repeats itself for decades, we're no longer talking about simple bad luck or investigative failures. We're talking about something that remains alive, acting in the shadows, spanning generations, and that's exactly what seemed to have returned now. As the days passed, the case went from being just a local drama to making national headlines. Newspapers, radio stations, and television programs competed for every detail of the story, often distorting facts to capture viewership. The girl's disappearance quickly became a media spectacle. I had seen this before, a family's grief transformed into fodder for heated debates and sensationalist stories. Some media outlets began to suggest dark theories. There was talk of satanic cults, occult rituals, and even alien abductions. The more absurd the theory, the more space it gained in the newspapers. This type of narrative has always bothered me because instead of helping, it ends up contaminating the investigative process with rumors and distractions. But there's no denying it. The public consumes these stories like soap operas. Media pressure also fell on the police, who were forced to give quick answers even without concrete evidence. Press conferences were called almost daily, but they always ended with more questions than answers. Meanwhile, alternative versions of the story proliferated on social media, with people claiming to have seen the invisible man in different parts of the country. All this commotion not only hindered the investigation, but also created a climate of mass hysteria. Neighborhood children began reporting similar imaginary friends, sending parents into a panic. It was difficult to separate media influence from real manifestation. But deep down, I knew, when the invisible gains media attention, it finds new ways to infiltrate the collective imagination. It was while talking to the psychologist who was treating the girl that I learned crucial information. She described the little girl as a sensitive, introverted child, but with a look that seemed to carry secrets bigger than her age would allow. In sessions, she always mentioned the invisible friend with a frightening naturalness, as if she were talking about someone real. And this deeply intrigued her, as there was no trace of fantasy in her tone. The psychologist reported that the child described this protector as a kind person who promised to take her to a better place. This detail sent chills down my spine, because in previous cases, I've heard the exact same narrative from other children. A mysterious figure who offers comfort but ultimately leads to disappearance. It was as if we were witnessing a modus operandi, invisible operandi, repeated over the years. She also noted that the girl seemed to obey rules established by this being. Set playtimes, kept secrets, even strange tasks, like drawing symbols she didn't understand. This pattern of behavior revealed a frightening level of influence. It wasn't just a psychological escape, it was as if an entity was shaping her mind, step by step, until it made her vulnerable enough to disappear. Before ending our conversation, the psychologist confessed something in a low voice. She had the feeling that her friend wasn't just talking to the child. During certain sessions, she felt the atmosphere change, as if someone were watching her. She didn't want to seem fanciful in front of her colleagues, but looking me in the eye, she said, "Katherine, I swear sometimes it felt like we weren't alone in that room." During a more thorough sweep of the yard, we found something that seemed out of place. Buried shallowly was an antique porcelain doll, its paint worn away by time. No one in the family recognized the toy, and the mother swore she'd never bought it. Holding it was strange. Too cold, even under the blazing sun. The kind of detail that makes your skin crawl for no apparent reason. Examining the doll, I realized it was no ordinary one. Its clothing resembled costumes from decades past. And its eyes, though made of glass, conveyed an unsettling sense of presence. Beneath the dress were hand-scrawled inscriptions, symbols reminiscent of ritual markings. The first question that came to mind was who had placed that object there, and why? It wasn't uncommon in my investigations to find objects used as anchors, things that function as connecting points between the visible and the invisible. If this doll truly served this purpose, then it wasn't buried by chance. It was a link, an artifact of control, or perhaps of summoning, and the coincidence of it appearing precisely in the missing girl's house couldn't be ignored. As I examined the object, I noticed that even the most skeptical officers kept their distance, as if something repelled them. And if there's one thing I've learned throughout my career, it's that we should take even our most irrational instincts seriously, because sometimes they're the ones that alert us to what our eyes can't see. And this doll seemed to be a key to doors that should never be opened. When the experts finished analyzing the doll, the investigation took an unexpected turn. The fingerprints found didn't belong to any family member, neighbors, or close acquaintances. The shock came when the database revealed a match. They belonged to a young woman who had disappeared over 30 years earlier, whose case had never been solved. It was as if the past had left its mark on the present. This detail shook everyone. The connection between disappearances so distant in time seemed impossible to ignore. For me, the doll was more than a forgotten toy. It was a vestige of continuity, proof that the invisible man wasn't just acting now, but for decades. The question echoing in my mind was, how many children had been taken before this one? Revisiting the old files, I noticed striking similarities, similar drawings, identical accounts of imaginary friends, and even strange objects found near the scenes of the disappearances. It was as if we were dealing with an entity that perpetuated itself over time, selectively choosing its victims, always leaving a subtle trail, but never enough evidence to end the cycle. This twist not only broadened the case, but also heightened the community's fear. If this had been going on for generations, it meant we weren't dealing with a simple criminal, but with something that defied the very notion of time and logic. And at this point, even the most skeptical investigators began to admit that the invisible played a larger role than anyone wanted to believe. After months of investigations, interrogations, and clues that faded into thin air, the police decided to close the inquiry. Officially, the girl's case was classified as an unsolved disappearance. To me, this decision felt more like a shortcut than justice. It was easier to shelve the case than to admit that we were dealing with something bigger, something beyond the reach of reason. A sense of helplessness hung over us all. Exhausted police officers, disbelieving neighbors, a family torn apart, and I, with the bitter conviction that we hadn't even come close to the truth. It was like trying to hold smoke in my hands, and with each page of the final report, it became clear that the invisible had won that battle. The archiving brought relief, only to the bureaucrats. For those who lived there, fear remained. Children continued to sleep with the lights on, parents avoided leaving their little ones alone, and stories of shadows and voices spread like wildfire. The entire community carried a collective ghost, even heavier than the police's silence. In my experience, closing a case doesn't mean closing a story. It just means letting it slumber until something awakens it again. And deep down, I already knew this wasn't an end. It was just a pause. The invisible, when not confronted, always finds a way to return. And how it would return, I still had no idea. Years later, when the case seemed forgotten by official records, the older sister came back to me. Now a teenager, she claimed to have recurring dreams about the invisible man. The disturbing detail was that, in the dreams, he appeared not as a shadow, but as a presence, whispering strange messages in her ear. Each night, she woke paler, as if being drained by something that wouldn't leave her alone. According to her, the man not only appeared, but also asked her to write symbols in school notebooks. Symbols identical to the ones her sister had drawn before disappearing. When I saw the scribbles, I felt that familiar chill. It was the same pattern, repeated with eerie precision, as if the entity had changed targets, now choosing the survivor as its new link. I began to analyze these dreams as possible coded messages. Some sequences of numbers and shapes resembled coordinates or even geometric patterns that could indicate specific locations. I'd seen this in other cases where victims reported visions that later led to concrete discoveries, but in this case it was impossible to know whether we were dealing with real clues or even deeper manipulation. The fact is, with this new evidence, the case reopened within me. I knew the police wouldn't care, but for me, every detail was a wake-up call. The invisible man hadn't finished his work, and if he was returning through her sister, it meant there was much more to come, and that perhaps the girl's disappearance was just the beginning of something much bigger. When the sisters' accounts began circulating among independent researchers, it didn't take long for the case to attract the attention of the esoteric community. Some paranormal researchers claimed that the child hadn't been kidnapped, but rather taken to another dimension. For them, the invisible man wasn't a criminal, but rather a spirit guide, offering passages to parallel realities. As fanciful as the theory seemed, I knew I couldn't dismiss it. I attended meetings with occultists, studying similar patterns around the world. Many told stories of children who, when interacting with imaginary friends, disappeared without a trace. Their explanation was that these beings didn't belong to our plane, but fed on the children's emotional energy to open portals. It was as if human frailties held the key to invisible realities. I myself had investigated cases where the line between the psychological and the supernatural seemed to blur. In some cases, symbols found in dreams coincided with real physical locations, such as ancient ruins or remote forests. This made me wonder, what if the girl had truly crossed some unknown threshold? What if the invisible was actually a guardian of the passage, choosing who could cross? These ideas were disturbing because, in a way, they offered a grim comfort. Perhaps the child wasn't dead, just somewhere else. But at the same time, they were a greater terror, because they meant she would never return. And each time I heard these theories, I felt we were facing something that surpassed not only logic, but also the limits of our own existence. While some delved into the paranormal, other experts preferred a more concrete view. Some argued that the girl's case was part of a criminal child trafficking ring. The invisible man figure was merely a metaphor created by the child's mind, unable to process the trauma of contact with kidnappers. For them, everything could be explained by psychological manipulation and veiled abuse. Reviewing the files, I noticed that in several nearby cities, child disappearances coincided with rumors of organized groups using symbols and rituals to mislead the police. This would explain the strange drawings and even the presence of the antique doll. It was not uncommon for criminals to use objects to create an atmosphere of fear, confusing victims and authorities. And the more bizarre the scenario, the harder it would be to uncover the truth. I had already investigated similar cases where drug traffickers exploited local beliefs to cover up heinous crimes. They manipulated families, planted cursed objects, and encouraged rumors about invisible entities, all to ensure silence and divert attention. This strategy worked because, when supernatural fear takes over, logic loses ground, and the culprits operate in the shadows. Although plausible, this theory also left gaps. How could we explain the phenomena witnessed by neighbors and even police officers? How could we justify such consistent symbols and reports over the decades? I found myself torn between two uncomfortable certainties. Either we were facing an extremely sophisticated criminal network, or something beyond human comprehension was manipulating everything. And frankly, neither option was comforting. After so many paths traveled, the case ended as it began, shrouded in mystery. No definitive evidence was found. No explanation, completely satisfying. For some, the girl was the victim of a criminal network, invisible to the eyes of the law. For others, she crossed a portal to dimensions we don't understand. I, Katherine, carry both hypotheses in my heart, but with the bitter feeling that both could be true. With each revisited account, with each re-examined symbol, I realize there's no clear line separating the real from the inexplicable. Perhaps the invisible man is an entity, perhaps a criminal mastermind, or perhaps a reflection of human frailty. What I know is that he continues to haunt us, whether as a collective fear or as a silent presence in homes where pain still echoes. The neighbors still tell stories, the older sister still has nightmares, and the files remain closed, guarding secrets no one dares revisit. However, the case lives on between the lines, in whispered conversations and suspicious glances. Because when a story remains unfinished, it doesn't die. It becomes a legend, fueling the imagination and terror of all who know it. And so, I continue with this open investigation within myself. The invisible never reveals itself completely, only insinuates itself, leaving enough traces to unsettle us. And it is at this point that the line between truth and myth blurs. After all, does the invisible man really exist, or has he always been among us, disguised as an ordinary human? Now tell me, how far would you be willing to believe in the invisible? That's the provocation this case leaves open. When we think of imaginary friends, we immediately picture innocent games. But what if they're more than that? Could we be ignoring signs that could hide frightening secrets right before our eyes? I want you to reflect. How many times in your life have you dismissed strange sensations, sudden chills, or coincidences that seemed inexplicable? Perhaps the invisible isn't as far away as we think. And just like in this investigation, sometimes the answers aren't in the obvious, but in what we prefer not to see. So I ask you, what would your reaction be if a child, a nephew, or even yourself started talking to someone no one else could see? Would you believe it? Or would you call it imagination? This doubt, my friend, is the kind of question that separates the skeptics from those who dare to face the inexplicable. If this story got you thinking, Don't let it die down. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join me on this journey of mysterious investigations. And of course, comment below, do you believe the Invisible Man was real, or was it all just a child's imagination? Your answer could be the key to the next investigation.